Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at the Roto node and the Roto Paint node. Those nodes are available to grab under the Draw menu under Roto and Roto Paint, and you could also access them by simply typing O for Roto and P for Paint. And you could do rotoscoping in the Roto Paint node in addition to doing paint strokes, and you could also just use the regular standalone Roto node to do your Roto work. It's up to the user. Many people like to use the Roto paint node, but I prefer to just use the Roto node for if I'm just doing Roto, just for the sake of speed, and so I don't have to worry about doing paint strokes in the same node. But it's completely up to you. But the Roto node itself is pretty straightforward. If I pop this out, as you can see, it's got the options over here to select your points, to add points in this menu here, as well as different roto shape curves. So if I zoom in here, you can toggle through these by hitting the V key. So you could do Bezier curves and B-splines. So by default, it's set to Bezier curves, and it gives you some flexibilities to do fall offs, and you could also right click and you could smooth out shapes if you wanted to. So you could right click and do smooth on each shape here, and you could also do you could right click and say like cusp to tighten things up too. But that's the Bezier, and there's also the B-spline node, which is already built in with more smoothness to it. So the difference between the Bezier and the B-spline, you could see if I do Bezier, it's a little bit more hard edge. So I personally always like to just use the B-spline because I like to have a little bit more roundness in it. So if we were to do a shape on of this mountain, for example, if I hit the V key and I just toggled all the way down to grab B-spline, you could see we could do more of a shape like that. And if you were to just close it off, you just bring it up and then you click on the last point, spline point, and it closes that shape off too. So you could just manipulate and bring shapes in close together. The other default shapes within the Roto node are the drawn a circle, which is pretty straightforward, as you could see. And you could also do rectangular. So that just gives you a rectangular shape. And all of these splines that you've created are listed under the root level of the Roto node itself too. So you could always come in here and by hitting the minus sign, you could remove these shapes. And we could hold shift select and then just remove points like that too. And then, for example, if you wanted to do another B-spline shape, let's say we added, oops, let me delete these. Let's draw a shape, for example, here. And let's say you needed to get more points on this thing. You could just grab this pen tool and you could just say add points. And you could start to add points to your roto shape. And we could also do the same thing by remove points. So we could select this, select another point there, like so. So it's pretty straightforward. And then you could use the cursor to select all and move your shapes if you need it. The other options too in this thing, if you have all the points selected, command drag and you could create fall off like this. And then you could also move these fall off points yourself too, just to adjust and control it. It's pretty straightforward. You could see right now the spline key is represented here, and we have a key on frame 27. So if we were to go frame 40 and we move our shape, you could see we just created a second spline point here. And then you could also use this keyframe button here too to go to previous and next frame. And if we actually view this roto shape and looking at the alpha channel, you have opacity controls within the Roto node itself, and you can also adjust feathering within this as well. And you could also adjust the feather fall off. So those are handy as well. The other thing, let me delete this shape. There's some other options in here with transform and motion blur. So motion blur would be, it's by default set to the shape. So if you had your shape moving fast, so let me draw a shape here and set a keyframe there, and then move this thing over here. And if we review this in the alpha channel, you could see we're animating this. So right now, the motion blur is set to the shape itself, but we're not seeing any motion blur. But if you set this to global motion blur, you could see we're getting motion blur on our roto shape. And you could also increase the motion blur amount and increase the shutter of the motion blur, and change whether the shutter is at center or at the start. So that's generally it with the Roto node itself. And if we wanted to look at the paint node, the paint node as well, if I close that out, has the same features as a Roto node, so we could draw shapes. And the only other features that are nice with the Roto paint node is obviously the ability to do clone work and painting. So let's delete this shape. I'm going to pop this out. And if we zoom in here, you could use the clone tool, and you could change the size of this clone, the brush, by holding shift and moving your cursor. And then if you wanted to change the clone point, if you hold command on a Mac and you move your point around, and now you could clone like so. And you could see we've got a clone stroke here, and it's telling us it's on frame 25, and our source was frame is the foreground. And if we wanted to clone from another source, for example, we have this other element here, and say we wanted to use this image for a clone source, on the up here in the viewer area, you see it's set to foreground. If we go to BG1, which is what this second image is plugged into, BG1, and you could add as many of these as you want. So you can see this is BG2, but right now we're on BG1, and we've set this here. We could clone from that second source as well. And if I undo that, you could also use this onion checkbox option to see the layer underneath, and you could also position that layer. So for example, we want to do this. You could use the onion transparency amount, and say we've used this to line up. And if I uncheck this, now we could get that paint stroke from that second image. Now, if I change frame, you'll see that stroke went away. And the reason for that is because the frame, this frame of this clone shape is set to frame 25. So since we don't have a shape on frame 26, that shape goes away. So if we go back to 25, those strokes are back, and we advance, those strokes are gone. So to change that, you just simply click on the life here, and you could set this to all frames. And you could see now we'll have that stroke. See, we have that on clone 2. We should set the same thing on clone 1. Set that to all frames. And now if we advance this to any other frames, those clone strokes will stay there. So that is the gist of the Roto Paint node. The other options you have in the Roto Paint node is obviously you could use the paint. You could use a paint option here. So you could either sample a color, and I'm holding command to sample here, and you could paint using those colors. And obviously same thing again with shift, you could change the scale, the brush size. Some of the other features too is you have, you could blur. So if I scale this size, you could see we could blur using the blur option, similar to Photoshop. And then we could also smear. If I scale this up, we could smear within the image as well too. So that's pretty much the the Roto Paint node, we will be using this in an example coming up, but that's just a broad overview of the Roto node and the Roto Paint node. And we will do a little bit more advanced things with these nodes in the coming video.